The early days, oh, a better nation, fair and free, Scotland.
Hello, this is Scottish Independence podcast episode number 172. This time I've got something very, very special for you. It's a speech given by Clive Ponting. Who's Clive Ponting? Well, if you don't know, I'll just read you a part of the introduction from Wee Ginger Doug on his blog. Clive Ponting is the original British whistleblower. Long before Assange and Snowden, Ponting leaked details of a cover-up that shook the British political establishment. Working as a senior civil servant at the heart of power, Clive Ponting grew increasingly disgusted by what he saw. The Belgrano affair was the final straw, and Ponting's leaking of documents to MPs sparked a scandal that would lead to his arrest, trial and eventual acquittal. Clive went on to pen books on the affair and is the acclaimed author of works on the green history of the world and deconstructing the myth of Churchill. Now, in this talk, he gets into some of the things that happened when he was working with the British government, but also why he supports Scottish independence and some of the things the British state might get up to in order to stop it happening. It's a must listen, and there's also a Q&A after the main talk. We'll just get straight to it and have a wee word with you at the end.
With no more ado, let me hand over to Clive, who's going to tell you his own story.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me along this evening. It's nice to meet the other people here. I thought I'd just start briefly by filling in a bit of my own background so you could understand what happened at the time of the Belgrano. I joined the fast stream of the civil service in 1970. Did the usual sort of jobs, one of which was being private secretary to the head of the department. And then in 1979 I was with Derek Rayner from Marks and Spencer's doing efficiency in Whitehall for Margaret Thatcher, finished up briefing her in number 10 and then the whole of the cabinet the next day. Then I went on to work on the defence budget, defence reviews, running the intelligence budget and so on. At the time of the Falklands itself, I wasn't actually involved in much of the operational side of things, a lot of the legal stuff. So it wasn't until March 1984, almost 2 years after the Falklands, that I finished up as head of the department that was dealing with naval operations and came across the Belgrano incident. Perhaps before I start on that, I ought to explain, I think, like an awful lot of whistleblowers, it's not one thing that does it to you in the end. That it's usually a pile-up of things, and that the Belgrano, in fact, turned out to be the last straw. I'd come across some pretty awful things going on, as you might expect, which I couldn't write about in the book that I wrote at the time of the trial and just after, because the government would have loved to prosecute me again. I mean, for example, the really nasty deals that were done with Pinochet in Chile over the Falklands. A person who I got to know later, called Colin Wallace, who was working in Northern Ireland and blew the whistle, as it were, on the what was known as Clockwork Orange, which was a campaign inside the army and the security services inside Northern Ireland to bring down first the Heath government, then the Labour government. He was subsequently framed for a murder that he didn't do and was in jail for the better part of 10 years. There was the Kincora Boys' Home that you might have heard about in Belfast, where the security services knew what was going on. You knew the boys were being abused, but let it go on in order that they could blackmail the politicians who were doing it. I had to work with MI5, getting some of their officers off after they'd murdered 2 people, planning for nuclear war in one of my jobs. And then actually it was only just before I went to the division dealing with the Belgrano. You may have heard of the NATO exercise called Able Archer 83 that got us within about an hour of all-out nuclear war through the absolute stupidity of the US and America and Britain and NATO. And I've never seen ministers so ashen-faced and worried about what they'd done. I mean, I can explain it more if you want to. Anyway, there I was in March, and I took over this division, and the first thing I had on my desk was a letter from the Shadow Cabinet to Margaret Thatcher with a load of questions, about half a dozen questions about the Belgrano, asking her to explain the various inconsistencies. And I was then summoned up to see the junior minister, the second in command of the department, a particularly nasty piece of work called John Stanley, who had been Thatcher's private secretary when she was leader of the opposition, told me that she was the greatest prime minister this country had been privileged to have, and that included Churchill. And he said, he followed Heseltine around Whitehall because he was the narc who kept an eye on what Heseltine was up to and reported back to Thatcher. Anyway, he said to me, this letter, I want 2 drafts. I want one that will tell the truth and one that will say what we've said already, which is the most extraordinary thing I'd ever been told to do in Whitehall. But like a good little civil servant, I did what I was told. And the 2 drafts, an explanation of what to do, finished up with Heseltine, who was Secretary of State. Now, he hadn't been there during the sinking of the Belgrano, so he knew virtually nothing about it. Anyway, he called me up and he said, I want you to go through the whole thing. You've got a week, but you've got to tell me everything that happened. I want every piece of paper. And then he said, I want to be sure there isn't a Watergate in this somewhere. Well, you didn't have to be a genius to realise, if it was Watergate, who Richard Nixon was. Anyway, I spent time doing what became known as the Crown Jewels, which was the complete account of what happened over the Belgrano. And it contained some of the most highly classified information that you could have in Whitehall. I mean, not just all the intercepts of the Argentine communications. We had them all. Well, in fact, actually, it was the Americans who did it, who passed it on to us. But anyway, we had all of that and some other stuff that I probably still ought not to mention. Anyway, by the end of that, it was clear that the whole government story was a complete load of lies. And Heseltine had a meeting that lasted for the whole morning on what to do. Interestingly, Admiral Fieldhouse, who was the commander of the Falklands operation, was then Chief of the Naval Staff, was there. And he said, yeah, well, this is all very well, but somebody altered my official dispatch. I said, what? He said, well, I wrote what had actually happened, and somebody in Whitehall changed it before it came out. But we couldn't ever track down who had done it. Anyway, then went all off to see Thatcher. Came back and it was decided that the cover-up would have to continue. And of course the problem with a cover-up is how you change the story. Actually, this wasn't that difficult. I mean, I told Heseltine how he could do it. And it was basically, you said, well, look, you have to understand we couldn't at the time say exactly what happened, operational security, blah, blah, blah. And now we're in a position where we can say a bit more. But no, he didn't want to do it. This went on and with Tandiel, who you'll know from, who in fact I never met until long after I was arrested, was asking questions. They refused to answer them. And then the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons asked a series of questions which, had they been answered truthfully, would have revealed the cover-up and exactly what had happened. And it was decided that they would continue. Now, this has gone on for 2 or 3 months. And it was at this point I decided that I was fairly disillusioned, obviously, because I'd been arguing for what we could do. And I suddenly thought, well, look, I'm actually one of the only person who probably knows what really happened, and I also know how they're lying about it. So I sent 2 documents down to Tam DL in the House of Commons. He did the right thing with them and gave them to the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who, being a Tory MP, handed them straight back to Heseltine. He then called in the Ministry of Defence Police. You probably don't realise the Ministry of Defence has got its own police force. It didn't tell them, they didn't have to be a bunch of geniuses to realise I was the most likely suspect. Anyway, I was told that this was all terribly embarrassing, and if you can resign if you want to. Well, I'd had enough by then anyway. So I said, OK, I'll resign. However, when they went to see Heseltine, he said, oh, no, I don't want him resigning. I want him prosecuted. So by the end of that week, I'd been charged under the Official Secrets Act, Section 2, which most people probably don't realise. It doesn't matter whether the information is classified, secret or anything else. Any piece of official information is covered by it. And the government and the prosecutors admitted that what I'd sent to Tam DL was completely unclassified. There was no secrecy about it, apart from the fact the government didn't want to reveal it. And this was the only time anybody so far has been prosecuted for sending information to a Member of Parliament. Anyway, after I was arrested, obviously the first thing to do was choose a solicitor. And there's not really much point in going to the bloke who buys your house for you and sorts out the mortgage, because they're not going. Anyway, luckily I had some very good advice as to who to go to. And he said, right, the only way we're going to win this is we don't fight by their rules, because we'll lose if we do. We'll fight this before we even get into court. And he agreed that, I had no money, that they would set up a defence fund, for which we managed to get the 3 leaders of the opposition parties, Owen, Steele and Kinnock, to be the patrons of the fund. Now, obviously, in the run-up, my phone was tapped, the mail was opened. I knew that's what they were going to do. Though we were a bit surprised, in the couple of weeks before the trial, we were meeting at my junior barrister's flat near Baker Street to hold meetings and stuff. And one evening while we were there, Jonathan said, my front door opened too easily tonight. I'm going to get the place swept. And of course we found the microphone that they put behind one of the pictures in the main room. Now, if it just went to MI5, we weren't particularly bothered about that, but we knew very well that they'd be passing it on to the prosecutor as to what our tactics were, etc., etc. Now, in the last week, 5 days before the trial was due to start, the government changed tack and said, we're going to put the crown jewels in as evidence. And this is the most highly top secret stuff you can get. Never been done before in a trial. One of the reasons was because then they could vet the jury and decide who they wanted on the jury, because it then became a sort of secrecy trial. Part of the trial would be held in camera with the press and the public out. Then we found out who they'd chosen as the judge. He was an ex-Tory MP candidate. The prosecution all the way through was a straightforward political prosecution. His cross-examination of me, I was in the witness box for 2.5 days, was to try and prove that the government was right to sink the Belgrano, which wasn't what the issue was at all. We also produced 2 expert witnesses. One was Sir Henry Wade, who was the Cambridge top professor of constitutional law in the country, to tell the jury that telling the truth to Parliament was one of the essential